Hi everyone. Let's talk about the Protestant Reformation. And your authors will talk about this, but I want to have a short little clip to talk a little bit about to place that within context. Now, Christianity began as an early Jewish heresy sect that was made up primarily of those that had been faithful Jews in the first century, but eventually broke off and began worshiping this so-called Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. So early Christianity is a new Jewish sect or a new Jewish break-off group, and it starts that way, but eventually over time begins to be more embraced even more by the non-Jewish community. As Christianity expands out of Palestine and further on across the Mediterranean, it really took advantage of the fact that the known world at the time was under the under the rule of the Roman Empire. So everywhere there was trade routes, where there was commerce, anywhere where there was the Pax Romana that covered the known world, basically Christianity spread, and as a result, it continued to spread most quickly across the Mediterranean areas that are now Turkey and Greece, and over into the Italian peninsula and all around the Mediterranean Sea. So, and it continued to expand, but it had early reactions against the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire considered them, early Christians, to be atheists because they worshipped a God that you couldn't see. It certainly wasn't Caesar at the time. And also, even sometimes early Roman writings refer to the Christians as cannibals, even because in the language of Christian worship, there's this verbiage of Jesus from the Gospels, Jesus describing or having this symbolism of bread and wine, and describing that as a symbolism, those symbols representing him. And he derives that from the early Jewish celebration of Passover, where you have bread and wine, and all these elements of food represent or symbolize something that's specific and important to their myths. So early Christian worship had this idea of bread and wine representing the body and blood of Jesus, and so early Romans had heard that these Christians were somehow eating bodies and drinking blood, and yet couldn't also go in and see what these people did behind closed doors, and so the rumor arose that these must be cannibals. And so early Christian worship really had bad reactions from the Roman Empire, and there were several major persecutions that occurred against Christians in the early Roman Empire from Nero and Diocletian and others. But every time it expanded, every time the Roman Empire persecuted the Christian religion, it seemed to expand and disperse even more. And that had an effect where by the late 3rd century, the late 200s, Christianity is so many places in the Roman Empire that it's now starting to convert Roman dignitaries and high-up officials. And by the beginning of the 4th century, it's the official religion of the Roman Empire, such that large councils can be called of Christian leaders from around the Roman Empire in order to come together and settle upon what these people all collectively believe. When controversies arise, you need a creed that can then settle the matter. What do we actually believe? What do we actually think that the early Christian writings actually say? And by 325, the Roman Emperor pulls all together the bishops throughout the Roman Empire at Nicaea to decide what do the writings actually believe, and that's where you get the Nicene Creed, and that winds up being a response to other controversies that arise as people try to disagree. Decides, well, my kingdom's going to be torn apart by this, so you have to decide what you believe on this, and you have early creeds that come out of that, from Nicaea, later on from Constantinople. But for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, they're pretty unified. And then in 1054, a great split happens. Year 1054, a great east-west schism occurs, where the Eastern Church, seeing the Western Church as kind of power-hungry and trying to execute a power grab, they split. And so the Western Church becomes dominated by the church headquartered in Rome, and the Eastern Church becomes has their most powerful leaders in Constantinople, or what today is Istanbul, but the Eastern Christians continue to expand and have their regional specific groups, like you have the Eastern Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox, and even the Egyptian Orthodox or the Coptic Church as well, but these are all Christianity in the East. The Western Church gets dominated by the church headquartered in Rome, or the Roman Catholic Church. And that continues on all throughout Europe for about 500 years until the 16th century. And in the 16th century, that's when because they had unchecked power, and because the Roman Catholic Church had become so integrated with the political structures in Europe, that, where church and state come together, some corruption can breed there. And so in the 16th century, that corruption was at such a level that it was a tinderbox. It was a powder keg waiting to happen, and all he needed was for the right person to light a match. And actually, there were several people that lit specific matches, and we would call those early church reformers. And what those reformers did, these are people like John Wycliffe, or just specifically Martin Luther in Germany, and even Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin in Geneva in Switzerland. These early church reformers were basically theologians who saw the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, not just political abuses, not the type of even abuses that we even talk about today, where the Roman Catholic Church has a problem with, say, many of the sexual behavior of even their priests in the Northeast. If any of you have seen the movie Spotlight, you understand. Now, those are entirely different types of abuses that are, the Roman Catholic Church has entirely different abuses that are related to the way in which salvation or guarantees of heaven are withheld unless you pay up. And there's this whole idea of purgatory, the idea of a person being in limbo while their sins are expiated and dealt with until they can go to heaven. So a person may die, the belief at the time is that a person may die, but they'll spend a great deal of time in purgatory while their sins are purified away until they can eventually go to heaven. Dante's Inferno somewhat describes this, and it was very much a part of medieval belief. Well, in the 16th century, Rome was building new buildings, and the St. Peter's Basilica, which is the main cathedral that is now in Rome today, it was being constructed, and it's got to be paid for by somebody. And because they needed money to pay off some of their construction projects, they need to pay off their loan from other barons in Germany. In order to pay off that loan, they had to start selling what's called an indulgence. An indulgence is, in the Roman Catholic system, is this idea that the Pope, because they have in the East, you have bishops over bishops basically are a pastor over a region, and you have priests under those. But in the Roman Catholic Church, the Bishop of Rome is the chief bishop, or the Pope. And the Pope can make a decree that if you can write an indulgence, is a certificate that the Pope can pronounce your relative, you or relative of yours or someone on your behalf can now get time taken off of purgatory so they go to heaven. Follow along with me. That's a certificate. An indulgence is a certificate that you or a loved one or whoever's name is on the certificate, that they have time off of purgatory, that they're going to heaven. Well, the medieval mind is such that the spiritual authority that's invested in the Pope makes this legit. I mean, our modern sensibilities sometimes can't wrap our mind around it, but in the time, that level of spiritual authority that's placed within, that's placed in the Pope, that would be a legit concern for somebody. Well, if the Pope is going to allow someone out of purgatory, well, for the cost of an indulgence, well, heck, sign me up and here's my money. Well, again, we in our modern mindset, we might pass judgment on those, but before you pass judgment, think about all the different religious practices that are around today and the spiritual authorities, and that we still in our modern context invest in people, and maybe don't judge those people quite so fast. Back to the 16th century. In 1517, a young Catholic monk named Martin Luther in Germany sees this, and, to use the modern vernacular, says, "Oh, hell no. You're not going to sell people an indulgence to pay for your building that somehow them or their relative is going to jump from purgatory to heaven." The guy who's selling indulgences at the time is going from town to town and really literally using the tagline, when a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Well, Martin Luther is going to have none of that. So he's a monk who is the priest of a local church there in Wittenberg, Germany. And at the time, he says this isn't going to work. So the church door at the time is basically the community bulletin board. So what he does is he writes down 95 reasons why this doesn't make sense. Well, each statement is a thesis. So each 95 lines, each statement a thesis of why this does not work. This doesn't make sense from the Bible. It doesn't make sense from church history. It doesn't make sense from logic. And that's what's he called a 95 theses. I encourage you to look it up and do some reading on this. And as he nails his 95 theses to the door of his church on October 31st, 1517. Now, October 31st, you go, well, that's Halloween. Yeah, well, Halloween is All Hallows Eve. It's the eve of all that's holy. November 1st is All Saints Day. It's a holy day in church history. And everyone shows up on church on All Saints Day, right? So he nails this on October 31st on his door, knowing everyone's going to read it as they're coming to church the following day. So his 95 Theses is nailed on the church door, October 31st, 1517, and that is, there are many other reformers and many other voices and many other authors you could read about and that you will read about in terms of early Protestant churches, but one of the key and one of the most vocal and one of the most public protesters or Protestants are protesting this abuse from the Roman Catholic Church is Martin Luther. And so this idea where from then on it spreads like wildfire, this idea of theologians by means of looking at the Bible, because in the early Enlightenment, this idea of checking the early sources, going to the original scriptures. The Roman Catholic Church claims to revere the Bible as its sacred text, right? Well, what happens then if we ourselves go to that sacred text and find that they're a little off concerning something that they claim? Well, that's a problem because a lot of people, the Roman Catholic Church is kind of proprietary, in a proprietary way controlling the Bible, but the average person can't read it because it's all in Latin. Well, and most priests can't even read it either because they're not highly educated. But Martin Luther is highly educated. Not only is he reading the Greek, the Hebrew, and the Latin, Greek and Hebrew from the original text, but he does the unthinkable and begins translating the Bible into the local language. And he translates the first version of the Bible into German so that people can begin reading it for themselves. Well, that allows the Protestant movement to spread even faster, and more countries and more officials and more political regions start breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church, saying you don't have that much control, you don't have as much control over us as you used to, simply because one, we can read it for ourselves, and two, we find out you've been fleecing us for this money all this time for something that you really don't have much control over. You yourselves don't have that level of control over who goes to heaven. So that's where the Protestant movement comes from. Well, in many cases, that has lasting effects for a lot of political movements throughout Germany as they begin throughout Europe, as they begin to break away and govern themselves, thinking now that people can still be religious, yes, and they can still be religiously Roman Catholic, yes, but the governments are not going to be controlled by the church. Our own tradition now today of separation of church and state really has the Protestant Reformation to thank for that. I say Protestant Revolution because it was revolutionary, but early Protestant thinkers, early Protestant scholars actually didn't want to achieve that. They didn't want to break away from the Roman Catholic Church. They just simply wanted the church to reform and correct itself. Martin Luther was very much a devout Catholic who didn't want to start Lutheranism. His early writings were very specific, that he wanted the church to correct itself, to reform, not to break away and start new churches and fracture Christianity into all the different traditions you see today. Many historians think that he would be heartbroken to see how fractured Christianity is now. But it's the logical legacy of all these different groups now being able to read the Bible and read a sacred text for themselves and decide what they like and what they don't. Now, having said that, There's a geopolitical ramifications of the Protestant Reformation, but there's also ethical examples of the Protestant Reformation. Now, as a result of the Protestant Reformation, it becomes the responsibility of many to not simply just ask the church, what do you think I should do and believe? It's now responsibility now falls on individual people to read the text themselves and be moral agents themselves, responsible to read the sacred text and follow its moral, ethical belief standards. So that places a great deal of responsibility in the hands of the individual. A great deal of the tradition of the West, in its focus on the individual, has the Protestant Reformation to thank for this. But we can go into this later, but the rise of the triumph of individualism has also had some problems in the West as well, and that has to be addressed also. But so that you understand, the Protestant Reformation can't be the influence of the Protestant Reformation on much of Western culture and how we see ourselves as free moral agents responsible to act ethically and morally in ourselves, not just under the direction of a pope in Rome. The impact, the legacy of the Reformation can't be overstated. So I wanted to put that all in context for you as you read through read about these early reformers from your text and understand the necessity why they feel to break away from the Roman Church and what's driving them as they write about as they go through their writings and make the case and make the arguments that they do. All right? Right. I hope this helps. Talk to you soon.